Thank you for that very generous introduction. And thank you so much to CEPS for providing the funding for me to attend this conference, just having recently come from New York, so this is very fresh research. This is, of course, a panel labeled History, but I hope to touch on some themes in my talk that will be of relevance to those of you who are interested in contemporary matters dealing with policing and security. I'm going to be talking about the 19th century, but I believe some of the issues I'm raising remain relevant today, and I'll return to those at the end of my talk. So this study, as Mark suggested, builds on my earlier work on Canadian and Australian history, where I examined the post-sentencing and post-incarceration phases of prosecution, or what might be called the tail end of the criminal justice system. The neglected tail end, and by neglected I mean historiographically, not underused historically. When I talk about neglect, if you were to stack all the books written on the history of policing and punishment against the number of books written on mercy, on pardoning, on executive discretion, well, the former would greatly overshadow the latter. Yet examining the history of executive discretionary justice in the form of pardons and commutations of prison sentences does not imply a lack of interest in power, at least not on my part. Rather, the opposite is the case, since discretion at the tail end involves the exercise of executive authority and sovereign power. Furthermore, adopting this orientation allows us to see more clearly the historic links between the dispensation of clemency and the enforcement of legal sanctions. Mercy's appeal, its deliberation, and its dispensation by the executive all depend on the application of law, the prosecution and conviction of suspects, and the imposition of sanctions in the name of the king, or in the case of republics, the people. So let me take you back to the 19th century. These linkages became dramatically evident in New York State over the period from 1839 to 1847. In these antebellum years, collective resistance on the part of tenant farmers exceeded the capacity of local sheriffs to suppress. It was the largest agrarian revolt prior to the Civil War. It helped pave the way for the free soil movement. Now, this protest stemmed from mounting tenant frustration over contractual obligations imposed on them through a centuries-old leasehold system. New York's first constitution in 1777 prohibited the signing of new leasehold contracts, which was a small step toward the dismantling of the manorial system that had been put into place by the Dutch Empire and continued by the English Empire, in fact expanded by the English. These imperial designs, which allowed landlords to accrue vast holdings, gave rise to a gentry class along the Hudson River and its hinterland. Tenants of the great landlords worked their land, for which benefit they paid rent in cash and in kind. And their contracts also specified services they were to provide on top of the fealty they were expected to express toward the lord of the manor. On the largest estate, over 1 million acres, owned by the Van Rensselaer family, tenants worked under perpetual leases, while the more common form of leasehold held for single lifetimes. Under both forms of tenancy, land, including all improvements and movable goods, reverted to the landlords on non-payment of rent and could never be alienated by tenants in fee simple. Meanwhile, tenants paid tax on the land while landlords paid none. Speaking of asymmetries. There were many landlords who did provide tenants liberal terms, often leaving rents uncollected or extending credit. However, the imbalance between landlords and tenants' legal rights grew more egregious to tenants after the American Revolution. Most of New York's great landlords had supported the revolution as a move toward greater independence, economic and political independence against parliamentary and royal usurpation. In contrast, most of their tenants were inclined to view the revolution as the defeat of despotism and aristocratic tyranny, such as the Hudson gentry class. So by using revolutionary rhetoric, tenants over the early 19th century roused support, and they attached their aspiration to own the land that they worked to the emerging Jeffersonian vision of a republic founded by landowning farmers, not white vassals locked in feudal servitude interminable, as the statement went. In the early national period, tenants began to work through the courts, pressing suits against landlords' pre-revolutionary manorial titles, but their efforts came to naught and frustration mounted. The more impatient and angry among them interfered in legal processes, occasionally threatening property and life. Law enforcement agents, primarily sheriffs, charged with serving writs of eviction, became targets of organized resistance, as tenants saw them as servants of landlords' economic interests, not agents of the law. Harassment and violence took the form of rough music, tarring and feathering, the seizing of papers, and threats of worse from knife and gun-toting white men dressed up as Indians. These so-called Indians became the shock troops of the anti-rent movement, which developed its own press and which gained political traction in the 1830s, aided by the anti-rent political party established in 1839. Most tenant supporters worked through the legislature and the courts, but these more radical members armed and disguised themselves in outlandish costumes that lent a sense of license and savagery to their actions. Well, not surprisingly, as they mobilized in greater numbers, property holders of all levels, and not just landlords, feared a mass revolt. On 3 occasions between 1839 and 1845, governors used the executive authority of their office as commander-in-chief of the state militia by calling out militia units. This involved authorizing sheriffs to organize posses comitatus, that is, an ad hoc form of citizen conscription for the purposes of imposing order and keeping the peace. In other words, this is a form of community policing set against community protest in an effort to secure the state against what appeared to New Yorkers on both sides of the conflict as an emerging class war. By recruiting local citizens, governors contracted out policing to a community of men in a security operation that blended vigilantism, policing, and military force. The period between 1839 and 1844 was marked by significant security breaches, the most significant of which was the shooting and death of an undersheriff late in 1844. In response, the governor issued proclamations declaring insurrections, that is, certain counties of New York in a state of insurrection, or perhaps in Schmittian terms, imposed sovereign rule through a state of exception. This meant throughout the tenant districts of central New York, hundreds of men on horseback, both officers of the law and citizen militia, swept across the countryside, entering tenant homes, ransacking property, destroying crops, and apprehending anyone suspected of being an Indian or sympathizing with them, locking up hundreds in jails for arraignment. Security measures also took the form of 2 legislative acts passed early in 1845, which aimed to overcome these swings between so-called Indian violence and militia sweeps, and to quell disorder. First was the Armed and Masked Act, which was a less draconian version of the more familiar Black Acts of English history. Second was an act to enforce the laws and preserve order, which widened the governor's discretion to suspend habeas corpus. Yet this search for statutory certainty and its enforcement through the impromptu deployment of law enforcers actually destabilized the state. Within a few weeks of the statute's enforcement, the nation's newspaper editors, who had previously raised a hue and cry about the anti-renters' attack on property rights, the very fundamental core of the capitalist order, began to feature sympathetic stories of the men filling up local jails, many incarcerated simply for attending rallies. By late 1845, sympathetic attention focused on 2 men deemed responsible for the sheriff's death, who were sentenced to death themselves, and on over a dozen others who were sentenced to life for manslaughter and highway robbery for seizing sheriff's papers. So this is where I return to my earlier remarks about the critical linkage between one form of order seeking in the executive's enlistment of the militia and its seeming opposite, the governor's constitutional authority to exercise mercy unfettered by legislative support or administrative constraints. In Governor John Young's proclamation of the 5th of January, 1847, declared less than a week after he had entered office, he noted that the powers of every department of the government had been called into action to calm the anti-rent excitement. Now was the point when the executive's kingly powers could act, which Young did by pardoning each of the 18 men who remained in prison after the era of mass arrests and convictions. Only a vindictive administration would deny a pardon now, the governor declared. But he also used his proclamation to expand on the virtues and necessity of executive mercy. This is what he said. It should never be forgotten that it is not severity alone in the administration of justice that secures the fidelity of the people to the government, but that mercy, when it can properly be exercised, is even more effective. And mercy, whenever extended by man to his fellow man, derived half of its beneficent influence from the cheerfulness with which it was bestowed. I quote these words because they contain echoes of Blackstone, Locke, and Montesquieu, each of whom, unlike Bentham, wrote of mercy as a critical cornerstone of good governance, particularly in an effort to restore the tranquility of the people, and in this case, to rectify injustice. The governor was evidently comfortable to identify his proclamation as a kingly exercise of executive power. If mercy was good enough for kings, Young thought, it was just as good for the governor of a Republican democracy. Surprisingly, he did not cite President Washington's pardon of the Whiskey Rebellion convicts in 1794, as might be expected for an American. Instead, Governor Young referred to the King of France, who had recently pardoned prisoners who had attempted to subvert the Constitution. He also linked his action to that of the English Colonial Office, which had authorized the pardoning of rebels involved in the recent rebellions in Upper and Lower Canada. As you might know, the Lieutenant Governor of Upper Canada in this period was George Arthur, of recent Van Diemen's Land vintage. Managed to get an Australian reference in here, who governed in the wake of the rebellion with what he called harshness and forbearance. It was widely believed that an agreement to pardon the anti-rent rebels was the bargain that Young made in order to secure his election. And for this reason, most historians of the anti-rent uprising regard the pardon as a brief and venal piece of political theater. Certainly, it was theatrical. This comes with the territory in gubernatorial as with royal proclamations. But in my opinion, historians who have examined this incident of mercy following indiscriminate severity have not placed it in the context of contemporary political and legal thought over the proper use of executive power in a democratic republic. It's only by doing so that we can fully appreciate why Governor Young, the dispenser of an extraordinary politically tinged pardon, was not impeached, as he could have easily been. This is because in 1821, delegates to the Second State Constitutional Convention had introduced an amendment that granted the governor authority to pardon in all criminal offenses other than treason. And then in 1846, at the Third Constitutional Convention, the governor's pardoning power was placed under greater scrutiny and debated at length. In the very midst of the anti-rent crisis, 1846, forward-thinking delegates called for greater transparency and accountability in pardoning and for the transference of clemency powers back to the legislature or perhaps toward a pardoning board. Yet the majority of delegates affirmed their faith in what they called the one-man power. So despite considerable momentum in favor of modern governance, the traditionalists won, thereby keeping constitutional Governor Young's blanket pardon after the third Constitution's ratification several weeks before the anti-rent pardons. I'd just like to close by referring to more recent sweeps, security sweeps, in the United States. Slower, but no less surely filling up the prisons of that country, but also prisons in countries such as this, in Canada, where Aboriginal people, people of color, the poor and undocumented immigrants are raising considerably the numbers of incarcerated people. More recently, there have been calls by pardon attorneys, ex-governors, academics. There are pardon clinics now in the United States as well for a return to a more robust form of pardoning in contemporary political life. Mark mentioned various ways in which we have communicated history. I did a law report feature a couple of years ago that talked about President Obama's pardon record. Currently, there are more turkeys pardoned at Thanksgiving than the current president has pardoned. It is a historic practice of the sovereign use of power that was robust historically, but has dwindled down to a mere drop in the present. And so I'm hoping that this work that I'm doing will revive that awareness of the use of executive power, not to punish, but to pardon. Thank you.